Good morning, everybody. Namaste, Hari Om. It's Swami Manamurti Saraswati here, David G. Little for QEEU. And today I'm going to present 4 live streams going through the Series 2 Transmission Science series that I've missed actually the last 3 weeks because I've been so busy doing a lot of work for QEEU and creating sciences basically and curriculum out of thin air. And today I'm just going to do 4 continual live streams, one after another. This one today is week 3. Week 3 is called the identity processor. So now we're going to begin. So this is week 3 of the transmission science curriculum or series 2. So the week 3 lecture is called the identity processor and permeability. This is the abstract. The lecture examines the identity processor, the cognitive narrative structure that governs human perception, self-reference, and meaning-making. In the context of the transmission series, the identity processor is not merely a psychological construct, but a developmental interface whose permeability determines whether the human system can access transmission state cognition. The manuscript outlines the architecture of the identity processor, the mechanisms of permeability, and the developmental consequences of identity softening. Integrated case studies, including the 1986 and 1988 transmission events 40 years ago for me, illustrate how identity permeability emerges in real transmission context. Introduction, Section 1. The identity processor is the central organizing mechanism of the human cognitive system. It is responsible for narrative construction, self-referential meaning, perceptual filtering, emotional interpretation, and continuity of personal identity. In Series 1, we introduced the identity processor as part of the vertical stack analogy. In Series 2, we examine it as a gatekeeper, the structure that determines whether transmission can enter the system. We all know about gatekeepers, right? Transmission requires permeability, openness, reduced narrative dominance, lowered interpretive rigidity. This lecture explains how the identity processor becomes permeable, very important, why permeability is essential for transmission, and how this process unfolds developmentally. Section 2. The architecture of the identity processor. The identity processor is a narrative-based cognitive engine that maintains the continuity of the self. It operates through 3 primary mechanisms. 2.1, narrative construction. The identity processor creates a continuous story of I, integrating memory, emotion, perception, expectation, and interpretation. This narrative is not emotional. It is the default mode of human cognition. 2.2, perceptual filtering. The identity processor filters incoming information according to relevance, threat, familiarity, and coherence with the existing narrative. Transmission cannot enter the system if this filter is rigid. 2.3. Meaning making. The identity processor assigns meaning to all experiences. This meaning making function is essential for survival, but becomes a barrier to transmission. Transmission is not narrative. It does not carry meaning. It carries coherence. The identity processor must soften for coherence to enter. 3. Identity rigidity versus identity permeability. Identity exists on a spectrum. Rigid identity, narrative dominance, conceptual fixation, low permeability. And 2, permeability identity, reduced narrative dominance, increased openness, and high permeability. Transmission requires the latter, permeability identity. 3.1. Rigid identity. Rigid identity is characterized by strong self-referential narrative, high interpretive control, resistance to non-conceptual states, emotional defensiveness, cognitive overconstructive. Rigid identity blocks transmission. So we all know about rigid identity, right? We've seen it many times and see it every day, basically. 3.2, permeable identity. Permeable identity is characterized by reduced narrative dominance, openness to non-conceptual states, lowered interpretive control, increased field sensitivity, mid-layer activation. Permeability is not weakness. It is developmental readiness. 4. Case study. The 1986 identity layer opening. In 1986, I experienced the first major, 40 years ago, the first major identity layer permeability event. This was not a philosophical insight, it was a structural shift. 4.1, the event. During a period of intense internal pressure and existential questioning, the identity layer loosened. The narrative structure temporarily dissolved, revealing expanded perception, heightened coherence, non-conceptual awareness. This was the first opening of the identity processor. Why it matters, 4.2. This event prepared my system for the 1988 balcony transmission, the 1989 Kriya initiation, the 1997 Rikia transmission. Identity permeability is cumulative. Each opening prepares the system for the next 5. Case study, the 1988 balcony transmission. The 1988 event is one of the clearest examples of identity permeability enabling transmission. 5.1, the encounter. Sitting on the level 6 balcony at Gengadarshan in Bihar School of Yoga in front of my guru, I experienced a sudden field level contact, a coherence beam entering my system, a complete bypass of narrative identity. This was not a psychological event. It was a transmission state activation. Identity dissolution, 5.2. During the event, narrative identity dissolved, perceptual boundaries softened, the system entered a non-conceptual state. This is the hallmark of identity permeability. 5.3. Developmental consequence. The 1988 event on the balcony one afternoon with Swami Satchidananda Saraswati, Paramahansaji, my guru, permeability altered the identity processor. It became more permeable, less rigid, more perceptible to field level information. This is why later transmissions, including the 1997 Rikier event, were so strong. 6. The mechanisms of identity permeability. Identity permeability is not random. It follows a structural sequence. 6.1. Reduction of narrative dominance. The narrative I becomes less central. This allows the system to perceive non-narrative information. 6.2. Softening of interpretive control. The identity processor stops trying to interpret everything. This creates space for transmission. 6.3. Activation of mid-layer gateway. As identity softens, the mid-layer becomes active. This is the interface through which transmission enters. When I say identity, I mean the I, the ego. Right, 6.4. 6.4. Increase in coherence sensitivity. The system becomes sensitive to field level coherence, transmission signatures, non-verbal information. This is the developmental hallmark of Series 2. 7. Identity permeability and transmission reception. Transmission cannot enter a rigid identity, meaning rigid identity, meaning ego, right? It requires openness, permeability, reduced narrative dominance, mid-layer activation. This is why transmission events often occur during moments of openness, during emotional vulnerability, during states of awe, during encounters with lineage holders. Identity permeability is the gateway to transmission. Just remember that. 8. The developmental role of identity permeability. Identity permeability is not the end state. It is the transmission state. It allows the system to receive transmission, enter coherent states, access non-conceptual cognition, stabilize higher developmental layers. Identity does not disappear. It becomes transparent. This transparency allows the system to operate in both narrative mode and transmission mode. This dual mode operation is the goal of Series 2. Conclusion 9. The identity processor is the central gatekeeper of human cognition. So I'll repeat that. The identity processor is the central gatekeeper of human cognition. Its permeability determines whether the system can access transmission state cognition. This lecture has shown the architecture of the identity processor, the difference between rigidity and permeability. That's very important. The difference between rigidity and permeability, the mechanisms of identity softening, the developmental role of permeability, case studies demonstrating identity layer openings. Identity permeability is the precondition for transmission. Remember that. Identity permeability. Look up what permeability means in case you don't know it. Permeability is a precognition for transmission. It is the foundation upon which the rest of Series 2 is built. Next week, we move to mid-layer gateway, the structural interface that becomes active once identity permeability is established. Key terms in week 3 is the identity processor, is the narrative-based cognitive engine. Identity rigidity, the strong narrative dominance ego. Identity permeability, reduced narrative dominance, increased openness. Mid-layer gateway, the interface for transmission reception. Transmission state cognition, non-conceptual, coherence-based perception. Cross-references with week 1, the transmission field, week 2, the Kriya Yuga philosophy, and the vertical stack analogy, which is next. Namaste, Ariam. Namo Narayan. Thank you.